Good morning. As you can see on the screen, we are making a transition at this point in our quarter where we are finished with our study of the book of Second Corinthians, and we're going to begin our study of the book of Galatians this week. As I said, we did wrap up Second Corinthians last week, and so if you missed any of those lessons, they have been recorded, and you can find them on our website at northlexingtoncoc.org, or you can find them on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in working through a study of Second Corinthians, or if you missed a lesson or two, I would encourage you to go back and to find those and watch through that study. They'll be available anytime you're interested. But we are going to begin our study through the book of Galatians right now. We just have 4 weeks left in this quarter. So we're going to be moving pretty quick, as we have all quarter long, in order to try to get through the book of Galatians here. So what that means is we're going to be hitting some of the highlights. We're going to be talking about how many of these big issues impact us in our lives. But there are going to be a number of things we're not going to cover very, very deeply. And so I would encourage you, as I have all quarter, to spend time on your own during your free time and your spare time, digging into some of these ideas that we don't cover as deep. The book of Galatians is a powerful book, a lot of compelling information within it. And so I would encourage you to go and dig deep and learn and take everything we can from this powerful epistle. So before we dig into the text, let's think just about a few ideas that I think are important in way of introduction to the book of Galatians. First off, it was written by the Apostle Paul, and it was written, is estimated around year 57 AD. It was written to a group of churches in the Roman province of Galatia, and these would have included Lystra and Derbe and Iconium and cities in that area. Paul, if you remember, while he was on his first missionary journey in Acts chapter 13 and 14, he traveled to this area and helped establish the churches there. So now Paul is writing back to those churches to continue encouraging them and help them work through the challenges that they were facing. The letter was written to help the churches in Galatia to be liberated from the bondage that came under the teachings of the old law. And it was written to help them experience the freedom from sin that could only be found through the gospel. Paul, in the letter we just finished studying 2 Corinthians, Paul spent most of his time defending himself and his apostleship against these false teachers that had infiltrated the church. But now, as we get into a study of Galatians, we see where Paul is no longer necessarily defending himself, but we see him defending the integrity of the gospel in chapter 1, and we see him defending the liberty that was made possible by Jesus as revealed in the gospel in chapter 2. So, as we get into our study today, let's see this study where Paul here continues to defend the truth, but here, instead of defending himself, he's focused on defending the integrity and the liberty that's found in the gospel. So let's begin by jumping into chapter 1, where we see Paul's defense of the integrity of the gospel. We see this all throughout this first chapter here. So as Paul begins, we see his introduction to the churches in Galatia in verses 1 through 3. See, after going through this long defense of his apostleship in Corinth, Paul begins this letter by establishing his credibility right away. He battled with it in Corinth throughout that whole letter. So now, at the beginning of this one, he goes ahead and lays the groundwork for his credibility and for his authority. He says in verse 1 that he's an apostle, not from men or through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. So as Paul is beginning this letter, he establishes his credibility by pointing to his apostleship. Not that he became an apostle because of he won a popularity contest among men, but he was chosen by God to take on this task to be an apostle. Paul wanted them to understand exactly where his authority came from. That it wasn't from man, but it was actually from God himself. By establishing his credibility at the start, his hope was that the churches there would recognize his authority and recognize him as an apostle of Christ and heed the message that he was sharing. And Paul, as he concludes this introduction here, he shares the same message we see him use in many of his letters that are recorded for us in the New Testament, where he uses this same phrase, grace to you and peace from God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So he issues this welcome to them, this blessing upon them. So as Paul finishes his introduction, he transitions into his letter. He jumps right in to his defense against those who were perverting the gospel message. He's defending the integrity of the gospel, but because there are people who are perverting the truth of the gospel message. See, as Paul here in verses 6 through 10 was reflecting on those who were perverting the gospel message, he stated in verse 6 that there were some within the churches of Galatia who had been called away to a different gospel. It's interesting that Paul would use this kind of terminology, a different gospel. You see, if we were to examine the ministry of Paul, we would see that he continually battled against these Jewish teachers who were trying to improve on the gospel of Christ by binding certain aspects of the law on others. In fact, we see this very idea addressed later on in chapter 2. We'll talk about it later in this lesson. But in order to keep this issue from growing in Galatia, Paul addressed this issue with 3 quick responses. First off, Paul said, you can't be perverting the gospel of Christ. But since there were some that had, he said in verse 6 that he was marveling that many were so quickly pulled away or quickly turned away from God to this different gospel. He said, here's this message that's being preached by these Judaizing by these Jewish Christians that are trying to bind the old law on the Gentile Christians. And here Paul said, I can't understand, I can't fathom, I marvel over the fact that so many of you have been pulled away by it. See, the word that's translated marvel, it literally means, it refers to a sense of wonder, right? Paul couldn't comprehend how the churches of Galatia had gotten to the point where there were so many people that were abandoning the truth. So the second response that Paul has to those who were trying to pervert the gospel was that he began pronouncing condemnation on those who perverted it, verses 8 and 9. See, to stress the seriousness of perverting the gospel, Paul made it clear that no one has the right to preach a gospel other than the gospel of Christ. I want us to notice Paul's strong words here. Notice with me Galatians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. It said, but even if we, or an angel from heaven, preached any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. And we have said, as we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. See, Paul here in this discussion, He said that anyone that preaches another gospel, whether it be him, whether it be an angel from heaven, it didn't matter who it was. If anyone comes and begins preaching another gospel other than what had already been taught to them, then that person was accursed or condemned. See, Paul wanted the churches in Galatia to understand that the only one who had the authority to establish truth is God. And any message that's not from him leads to condemnation. So here we have these individuals who are preaching a different gospel than what had been brought before him, what had been brought before them. And Paul stressed that anyone that does this is to be accursed or condemned for doing so. But notice this third response from Paul here in this section here in verses 6 through 10. See, he responded to those who were continuing to bind the old law on others by saying that all they were doing was seeking the approval of men rather than the approval of God. We see this in verse 10. See, the transition from the old law to the new law had to be a difficult one for many people in that day. Right? You think about these individuals who had lived their entire lives under the old law. They had held these traditions of the old law to be so important. And now, all of a sudden, those things that had once been so important are now not required. And you can see where this would be a challenge for many people to make this transition. But by continuing to bind aspects of the old law on others, Paul stated that those individuals were trying to make the Jews and former Jews happy rather than solely seek to please God. See, when they go so far as to bind these traditions of the old law on others, then they're more concerned with themselves than what God has to say or what God has commanded. So here, as Paul begins his defense of the integrity of the gospel, he addresses the problem of perverting the gospel message and how there were several within the churches in Galatia who had begun doing so. So from here, Paul continues his defense of the integrity of the gospel by pointing out in verses 11 through 24 through the end of the chapter here that his message came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. See, to validate his affirmation that his message was revealed to him by Christ, Paul pointed to three pieces of evidence from his life. He pointed in verses 13 and 14 to his past, to who he was before he became a Christian, before he became a child of God. He talked about in verses 13 and 14, talk about his former life in Judaism. He reminded them that he was passionate about persecuting the church and trying to destroy it because he thought that was the right thing to do. He even stressed how he had advanced in Judaism beyond most people. And he was zealous in keeping the traditions of the fathers under the old law. See, Paul shared this with them to help establish common ground with them. See, they held these traditions to be so important and so valuable. And Paul expresses to them that he too was in that same position. He knows how they feel, and he knows what they're going through. Paul established this common ground so that he could show them that he's not speaking on something that he's not aware of, but he's speaking on something that's all too familiar with him, that he had to overcome himself. The second thing that he points to prove that his message came from the revelation of Jesus was that was the conversion that he went through on the road to Damascus. See this in verses 15 through 16. See, although Paul lived such a dedicated life to Judaism. When God called him while on the road to Damascus to go preach Jesus to the Gentiles, he didn't hesitate in getting to work. See, all of those earthly advantages that he boasted in, the Hebrew of Hebrews, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, how he prided himself in the law, the tribe of Benjamin, all of these things that he was so proud of with his Jewish heritage, that were so valued in the Jewish community, said those things didn't matter to him anymore because of the call that came from Christ. And that was so much more important to him. So Paul points to his conversion and shows them that because Jesus called him, he was willing to put aside those things that were so important to him, those traditions of the law, those things that gave him value in the Jewish communities. But the third thing that he shares with him, with them, to prove that the revelation, that the message he had received was revelation from Christ, so he pointed to his isolation after his conversion. See this in verses 17 through 24. See, instead of meeting up with the other apostles after his conversion, Paul went to Arabia and then back to Damascus because many in the churches still feared him. We're told here in this text that it took 3 years for Paul to make it to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Can you imagine the emotional toll this must have had on Paul? To know that he left his life behind, his life where he had, he was well known, he was prospering in what he was doing, and now leaves that behind him and turns to Jesus, and now even the people that are on his team fear him and reject him. See, ultimately, in verse 23, even though it took time, Paul said people remembered his past, but recognized that he was now preaching the faith that he once tried to destroy. I think the reason that Paul recounted his past to them was to show that God had chosen him to preach the gospel. And that gospel was different and it was better than the old law. It didn't matter if Paul was more comfortable living according to the traditions of the old law. God called him to a better covenant. And because of that, he was willing to leave the old law behind. So as Paul here in chapter 1 is addressing the integrity of the gospel, he challenges those who are perverting the truth by bringing a different gospel, those who were trying to bind the traditions of the old law on those living under the new law. And Paul challenges them to show them that this new law is a better law. And even though it may be hard leaving those traditions behind and not holding on to those traditions, or forcing those traditions on others, he said God called us to something better. So we should be willing to leave that behind for the cause of Christ. See, the hope was that by defending the integrity of the gospel, the churches in Galatia would stop acknowledging a different gospel, and that instead they would latch on to the truth, the gospel message of Jesus. So after spending chapter 1 defending against the integrity of the gospel, against those who are trying to pervert the gospel, Paul transitions in chapter 2 to defend the liberty that was provided by the gospel. The gospel of Christ offers freedom from the bondage of sin in a way that the old law simply could not. That's why James referred to the gospel as the perfect law of liberty in James chapter 2 and verse 12. See, as long as the Jewish leaders continued to bind the teachings of the law of Moses on the churches of Galatia, they would never come to experience the law of liberty. It's because of this that Paul defended the law of liberty and tried to persuade the churches to fully accept it and live within it. So, in order to defend the liberty provided by the gospel, Paul, first here in chapter 2, refused to yield to the agenda of those who sought to bring them into bondage. Notice verses 1 through 5, where Paul discusses this idea. See, remaining under the old law was considered a form of bondage because there was no freedom from sin under the old law. Sin was continually there. There was a reminder of sin year by year, the Hebrews writer says. Paul referred to the fact that there some of these false brethren, they came in and they pretended to be interested in Christ so that they could find an opportunity to bring others back to the bondage of the old law, verse 4. See, this wasn't just happening in Galatia, but instead this was happening everywhere, and Paul had experienced it during his travels and during his missionary journeys. See, to illustrate this idea, uh, to illustrate his resolve in not giving in to those who were pushing this agenda of binding the old law on others, Paul pointed their minds to the events that took place at the end of Acts chapter 15, after what was called the Jerusalem Council. See, the Jerusalem Council, which we can study and read about in Acts chapter 15, was a meeting among many church leaders, specifically Paul and Barnabas and the elders of the church in Jerusalem and a few other church leaders. They had gathered together and they had discussed whether or not the traditions that were followed under the old law needed to be bound on the Gentile Christians. So those things that were these false teachers had been pushing in chapter 1 that Paul was referring to, they had discussed this in a meeting in Jerusalem to figure out what needed to happen under this new law. Did these things in the old law that were so important to them need to be bound on the Gentile Christians, or did they not have to bind these things? The conclusion was that the Jewish traditions, specifically circumcision, they were not to be bound on the Gentile Christians because they were not commanded by God under the new law. So many of the Jews continued to practice these traditions, and what we're going to notice later in this chapter is that many of them still thought less of the Gentiles for not following those traditions themselves, even though they weren't required to follow these traditions. Many of them still struggled with the fact that the Gentiles weren't holding these traditions from the old law. Because of the conclusions that were drawn from this Jerusalem council, Paul explained that he didn't even require Titus to be circumcised, even though he was traveling with him. As Paul was going and meeting with these different churches, Titus was alongside of him, and they didn't require that he be circumcised. See, Paul defended the liberty of the gospel by not yielding to the agenda of these Jewish leaders. Although the easier thing to do would have been to force Titus to be circumcised, to abide by these traditions of the law. Paul refused to bind someone and keep them from fully experiencing this law of liberty, because that wasn't, he had no place to bind that on anyone. So we see first here, Paul defends the liberty provided by the gospel by refusing to yield to the agenda of others. But as we move forward in this chapter, we see in verses 11 through 13 that Paul defended the liberty provided by the gospel by confronting the hypocrisy of others. Specifically here in verses 11 through 13, we see where he confronted the hypocrisy of the Apostle Peter. See, Paul stated that for a period of time, Peter was fellowshipping and enjoying common meals with the Gentiles in Antioch, verse 12. See, Peter wasn't bothered by the liberty that was offered under the new law. And he enjoyed his time with the Gentiles who exercised that liberty. Peter understood what the law said. He understood what this liberty meant in the gospel of Christ. And he supported the Gentiles who chose to live under that. But we see that when Jewish Christians who were sent by James arrived in Antioch, things changed for the Apostle Peter. We're told that Peter withdrew and separated himself from the Gentiles. And we're told the reason he did this was because he feared what the Jewish Christians would think of him if they found him associating with those who didn't bind themselves to the traditions of the old law. Peter was afraid that by spending time with the Gentiles, those who weren't living by these traditions of the old law, that the Jews would think less of him because of his association. But what's really interesting is we see in verse 13 that because of Peter's example, he ended up causing others to get caught up in the hypocrisy with him, including Barnabas. See, Barnabas was known as the son of encouragement. But even he feared what the Jewish Christians would say, so he withdrew from the Gentiles as well. Since Peter and others began getting caught up in this hypocrisy as a result of this, these teachings of the Jewish leaders about the traditions of the old law, Paul, when he arrived in Antioch, verse 11 tells us that he withstood Peter to his face. You see, by withdrawing from the Gentile Christians, Peter was expressing that he was not in complete support of those who exercised the liberty given to them in the gospel. Maybe he didn't intend to do this or to communicate this, but he did it nonetheless. By withdrawing from them and not associating with them anymore, he was showing his support in favor of the Jews who were trying to bind the traditions rather than supporting those who were exercising the liberties that were granted to them in the gospel. And it's because of this that Paul confronted Peter, and he addressed the hypocrisy in order to ensure that it didn't happen again. See, the liberty that can be enjoyed through the gospel is one of the greatest blessings of the gospel. And Paul was not going to stand by and let that liberty be threatened, especially by someone that was supposed to be a spiritual leader for them, someone that people were looking to for guidance and direction. Paul wasn't going to let this happen. So he confronted the hypocrisy about those who were kind of going back and forth on the liberty that's provided by the gospel. So after confronting this hypocrisy, we see where Paul he issues his response to this hypocrisy. He understood the importance of addressing this issue and sharing his response to the churches in Galatia. We see this in verses 14 through the end of the chapter in verse 21. The reason that Paul made such a big deal about addressing the hypocrisy was because they were not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel, verse 14. By expressing this hypocrisy and withdrawing from the Gentiles, they weren't being straightforward with what the gospel message was. See, understanding that his hypocrisy affected so many people, Paul addressed this issue. But what we're told is he addressed it in front of everyone. Everyone who was involved in this issue was involved in this discussion. See, he addressed it by asking why he was compelling Gentiles to live like Jews when Peter himself had been living like the Gentiles. Right? Peter had embraced the liberty of the gospel before the Jewish Christians arrived, but he began to change his whole tone when the Jewish Christians showed up. So he was living and experiencing and promoting the liberty of the gospel when it was just him and the Gentiles. But when the Jews came, he was afraid of what would happen. And so he began pushing the Jewish traditions on the Gentiles when he himself was not living according to that custom, but he had accepted the liberty of the gospel. So Paul says, why would you force others to live according to something that you're not living according to? See, by being so wishy-washy in his approach, it didn't send a clear message about the truth of the gospel. Peter wasn't being straightforward with the truth of the gospel. So Paul addressed this issue to get to the point and help them understand the importance of the liberty that was offered by Jesus. Paul concludes his response here by reminding the crowd that everyone is justified by faith and obedience and not by works or traditions of the law. See this in verses 15 through 21. See, someone could keep all of the traditions that the Jews had and keep them perfectly. But if they were not obedient to the law of liberty, then they could not be justified. It didn't matter how faithful they were to the old law, they could not be justified. And Paul says this, verse 16, where he said, no one is justified by the works of the law. So no matter how faithful they were to these Jewish traditions, they could not be justified by keeping them. There was something deeper, something more important that they needed to be focused on. With this being the case, Paul charged them in verse 20 to be crucified in Christ. See, when we're crucified in Christ, then we're no longer concerned about what we want or what others think about us, because it's no longer us who's living, but instead it's Christ who's living in us. See, Christ died on the cross so that everyone could experience the liberty that can only be found in the gospel. And by holding to the bondage of the old law, it minimizes the effect of the sacrifice of Jesus. The objective of Paul's response here in Galatians chapter 2 was to point the churches in Galatia to the importance of embracing the perfect law of liberty. That they too need to be crucified with Christ, where it's only his gospel, this new law, that matters to them. That the life of Jesus is shining through their lives rather than their own thoughts or their own opinions or their own desires or their old traditions. So Paul, here in chapter 2, he defends the liberty provided by the gospel. Now, as we think about what this means for us, I think it's important that we focus on that message here from Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. See, maybe we're not in that same position where we are being bound by the old law, by those traditions. But I wonder how often we allow ourselves to be bound by other things that pull us away from the liberty that we can find in Jesus. See, the ultimate goal is for each of us to allow ourselves to be crucified with Christ. Or it's not us that's living anymore, but it's Jesus who's living in us. And the life that we live through faith in obedience demonstrates that Jesus is living through us. Through his death on the cross, Jesus provided liberty for us, liberty from sin. And we need to live lives that express that we are living within that liberty and experiencing that liberty. That concludes our study this week of the book of Galatians. Next week, we'll continue by working through chapters 3 and chapter 4. So if you want to go ahead and be reading those chapters to be prepared for our study, that would be great. But we'll pick up again next week. Thank you all very much.